Here we go, The Secret Lake, Chapter 16, The Return Visit. The first day of September had brought with it gray skies and an unseasonably sharp breeze, and the children stood shivering at Mrs. Moon's back door. The patio garden was a far cry from the courtyard of dappled sunlight they had sat in a week earlier. As she opened the door, Mrs. Moon's face lit up. "Tom and Stella, how nice to see you, dears. Come along in. It's really quite blustery out there." Tom and Stella stepped quickly into Mrs. Moon's kitchen. The old lady had renewed vigor and a quickness of step they had never witnessed in her before. She immediately directed them through the hallway into a sitting room next door, which was crammed full of dark furniture, covered here and there in lace cloths. A handsome standard lamp in one corner bathed the room in warm yellow light, while a somber-looking man in an enormous portrait hanging above the fireplace eyed the children suspiciously. The old lady found their gaze upwards as she stood leaning on her stick. "Oh, don't worry about that, dears. That's just Edward." Tom and Stella each chose a chair and sat down. "Who's Edward?" said Stella, adjusting the velvet cushion behind her. Mrs. Moon sat carefully down on an upright chair opposite the fireplace. "That's better," she said. "You see, I know I can get out of this one. Ah, yes, Edward Moon, dear, my late husband. Such a lovely man." She chuckled again to herself. "You know, we used to joke about that picture. We always said the young artist must have caught Edward on a bad day." She paused for thought, then raised her small, wrinkled hand to her mouth. "Or was it the other way around? Dear me, I do seem to have forgotten." "It's beautifully painted," said Stella, trying to sound like her mother. "Well, yes, of course, dear. Anyway, enough of Edward. How nice of it to see you at last, and especially after my silly upset last week." "What upset?" said Tom suspiciously. Stella raised her eyes to the ceiling. "Well, you know, dear, I wasn't quite myself. All that confusion. Anyway, Dr. Brown seems to have fixed me, and Charlie was brilliant as usual." Tom narrowed his eyes. "I feel so much better," Mrs. Moon said. "Such marvelous medicine they have these days. Would you like some juice, dears? Apple or orange?" "Orange, please," said Tom as the old lady slowly rose from her seat. "Yes, please," said Stella. After their last visit, she didn't like to offer to help, so instead, she cast her eyes around in wonderment at the beautiful pictures and objects that crammed Mrs. Moon's living room. As the old lady disappeared back towards the kitchen, Tom raised his eyebrows mischievously. Then, to Stella's alarm, he jumped up from his seat and started wandering from table to table, fingering the array of silver-framed photographs, trinkets, and ornaments that filled almost every surface. This was the stuff of his dreams, a real live treasure trove. "Leave them alone," whispered Stella. She could hear Mrs. Moon pottering about in the kitchen next door, but Tom, being Tom, ignored her, and when he had completed a circuit of the room, he delivered his sister a cheeky grin and then disappeared through another doorway. Stella jumped up from her seat to give chase just as Mrs. Moon reappeared, pushing a large trolley. On the top shelf sat a silver teapot, blue floral milk jug, teacup and saucer, and 2 glasses of orange juice. On the lower shelf sat a large platter crammed with biscuits. "Tom," Stella called crossly, her eyes glued to the biscuits. Then she remembered herself. "I'm sorry about my brother," she said, then smiled politely. "He's rather nosy, I'm afraid." Tom appeared at the doorway looking strangely embarrassed. "I see you found my bedroom, Tom," said Mrs. Moon, taking up the biscuit plate. "Did you find anything interesting, dear?" She winked playfully at him. Tom smiled awkwardly and sat down. His normally rosy cheeks had drained, and as Stella selected a pink iced biscuit, she couldn't help but smirk that her brother for once had been caught out. "Would you like a biscuit, dear?" "No, thanks," Tom said weakly. Stella almost choked on her orange juice. She had never known Tom refuse a biscuit. Everyone paused for thought, and then Tom spoke again. "Where's Harry, Mrs. Moon, and Charlie Green?" He was in defiant mood and obviously didn't give two hoots about giving this old lady a heart attack. Stella cleared her throat impatiently and then held her breath. Ah, yes, dear Harry. Mrs. Moon leaned forward from her chair with a strange smile. Then, with a shaking arm, poured herself a cup of tea. She sat back, took a sip from her cup, and then lowered it decisively onto the saucer. As the clank of china reverberated around the room, Stella and Tom both flinched. Now, as the old lady cleared her throat, Stella knew that she was about to make her announcement. Stella crunched hard on her biscuit and stared beyond Mrs. Moon, trying not to look too interested. As she did so, she fixed her gaze on an old trunk covered in a white lace cloth, down to the side of Mrs. Moon's chair. As the old lady began to speak, Stella's stare remained fixed on this seemingly obscure piece of furniture, and yet the longer she stared, the faster her heart began to beat. Mrs. Moon started to say something about Harry and Charlie, but suddenly Stella wasn't listening. By now her cheeks were burning. Her eyesight wasn't bad, but in a dim yellow light, she couldn't be sure of what she was seeing. With her head spinning, Stella downed her glass of orange juice in one and plonked it on the trolley in front of her. Is there any more juice? She blurted out. An awkward silence filled the room as Stella felt her cheeks turn purple. She then gave Mrs. Moon the most enormous grin. This rudeness wasn't like her at all, but she just had to get a look at that trunk. With a look of surprise, Mrs. Moon began to raise herself from the chair. Why, of course there is, dear. Help me up, will you, Tom? Shall I get it? Tom offered politely. Stella looked at her brother in astonishment. First refusing biscuits, now offering to help someone. Exactly what had come over him? Oh, no, dear. I'm fine, said Mrs. Moon gently. You sit down. I shall be right back. Hey, Stella. Tom could barely contain himself, but Stella didn't hear him. He was already at the side of the trunk. Look, Tom, look, she said excitedly. Though worn in places, the gold lettering was clear enough, and yet as she took deep breaths, Stella could barely believe what she was reading. There it was, clear as daylight. Miss S.E. Gladstone. Tom was quickly at his sister's side, and as he crouched down and read the words, a broad grin spread across his face. Sophie Gladstone. Stella gasped in a whisper. Mrs. Moon must be Sophie. Oh my gosh, chapter 17, I can't quit. Dear me, I see you've beaten me to my story, dears. The children jumped up in alarm. Mrs. Moon stood in the doorway holding Stella's glass of orange juice. She had a strange smile on her face as she fixed a vacant stare on the children. And now Stella remembered. This was the stare she had given him that day in the polite patio garden. It was a stare that at the time had felt familiar, but while she had cast aside in her mind. Sophie Gladstone, said Stella in astonishment. Is that your real name, Sophie Gladstone? Mrs. Moon's face lit up with amusement. Oh, dear me, no, dears, look. Her face was beaming as she gestured with her stick towards a second trunk, sitting in the far corner by the window. There's mine, over there, dears. Stella walked slowly across the room towards the trunk, her heart thumping against her chest. As she crouched down and carefully lifted the white lace, a haze of tears blurred her vision. But it didn't matter, of course. She knew what the letters would say. After a moment's pause, she wiped her eyes. Then with a quivering voice, she read the name out loud. Miss E.M. Gladstone. Mrs. Moon placed the glass of orange juice on the trolley. That's right, dears, she said gently. I am Emma Gladstone, the same young Emma you met when you traveled down the time tunnel. She shook her head, sighed deeply as her eyes began to glisten. Dear me, it seems such a long time ago. Stella stood up and stared across at the old lady, already searching for signs of Emma. Suddenly, the old lady smiled at Tom, then she winked. Tom had guessed, hadn't you, dear? To Stella's surprise, Tom gave a triumphant grin. She turned towards her brother in disbelief. But how, Tom? How could you possibly have known? Mrs. Moon nodded towards the door Tom had disappeared through earlier. Tom the Unstoppable, she said, chuckling. I should have known you'd go snooping in there, Tom. Now along now, dear. Show your big sister. Go along. As Stella followed Tom into the bedroom, her eyes froze open. The walls were crammed with large gilt-framed portraits, each one bearing the name Gladstone on a bronze-colored plaque at the bottom. But Tom ignored these paintings. Instead, under the solemn gaze of various members of the Gladstone family, he strode around the bed and to the far end of the room. There, in pride of place above a fireplace, hung by far the smallest picture. As she approached, Stella saw it was the young, dark-haired girl holding a small dog. E.M. Gladstone read the tag across the bottom. It was the same picture they had seen in the Gladstones' dining room when they traveled down the time tunnel. Emma Margaret Gladstone, said Mrs. Moon from the doorway. And Harry, of course, dearest Harry. But come now, let's sit down again. There is really much to tell. Stella's mind buzzed with questions as they left the bedroom. Could this old lady really be Emma? Was it possible she was still alive after all that time? If this was here, what was she doing living in a different house in the garden? And what did Charlie Green have to do with all this? The children sat down again. Well, dear, said Mrs. Moon slowly, I do believe I owe you an explanation. She smiled as she looked each of them in the eye. No doubt you've been wondering if your adventure wasn't just a silly dream. The children nodded in silence. Well, my dears, I can tell you it wasn't a dream. She shook her head and chuckled. I shall never forget the day Harry found you behind that bush when we were out having lessons with Miss Walker. And do you remember the look on my face, Tom, when Jack dropped down the chimney breast? Tom could smile and nod as his throat went tight. You know, I was sure it was going to be my good friend Lucy, said Mrs. Moon, all ready to look for the moles. What a shock it all was, but oh, what an adventure. And now as the old lady's eyes began to sparkle, Stella could see how delicately time had traced itself into her small, pale face. Yet despite the wrinkles, she was still very beautiful. The child's face was still in there, the dark round eyes eager for adventure. This was Emma, all right. Her youthful spirit had never left her. It had simply got buried as she had grown older. I'm sorry we had to leave you, said Stella weakly. We really wanted to bring you with us, you know. Oh, don't you go worrying yourself about that, dear, said Mrs. Moon brightly. My adventure didn't end there, you know. Tom and Stella sat up in surprise as the old woman gave a mischievous grin. You see, my dears, 2 days later, Lucy and I went on our own mole hunt. I'd told her about you two in the time tunnel, of course. She was desperate to come and meet you again. It was her idea that we should look for the tunnel as soon as possible. Now the old lady's eyes sparked again. And do you know what, Tom and Stella? She clutched her chest like an excited young child. The moles danced for us, and we rode across the lake, and we found the tunnel. Tom was leaning so far forward he almost fell off his chair. Where did it take you? Asked Stella. She held her breath, hardly daring to think what she might hear next. Well, said Mrs. Moon, sitting back, I was hoping we would be able to visit you in the same time as you had come from, but instead we came out in the garden at a time beyond even today. Stella put her hand to her mouth just as Tom's chair collapsed on the floor behind him. Wow, did you see aliens and stuff? He cried, scrambling up. Stella shot him an impatient glance as Mrs. Moon smiled and gazed toward the window. You know, dears, the garden was still as enchanting and happy a place as ever, filled with children's laughter and fun. She breathed in deeply and sat looking at the children. Mrs. Moon, what did you find? Asked Stella nervously. The old lady hesitated and then she smiled. Well, all I will say, Stella, is I am sure you will both enjoy the garden for many years to come. Stella bit her bottom lip. as she tried to take in what Mrs. Moon had just said. Did this mean they were going to meet Emma again in the future? Somehow she knew that she couldn't ask. "But you did go back home afterwards, didn't you?" she said. "Oh, yes, of course we did, dear. But we got into a lot of trouble, you know." Tom and Stella leaned forward, eager to hear more. "You see, we had stayed away for 3 days. The police were called and they went on at us so much in the end we told our story. Of course, no one believed us and we couldn't prove it. My father never really forgave me for making him look so foolish. It was all over the newspapers." A wave of sadness broke across Mrs. Moon's face, but passed as quickly as it appeared. "By the time I left home and met Edward, I'd started using my middle name, Margaret." "But why?" asked Stella. "Well, you know, everyone I met as I was growing up seemed to remember the Emma Gladstone time tunnel story, and it all got so tiresome in the end." The old lady stared up at the portrait again. "Edward died 20 years ago. We hadn't any children, and it was only then I decided to move back to the garden. With the houses all divided into flats, now it was perfect for me. I do so love it here." "But what about Harry?" said Stella suddenly. Mrs. Moon chuckled. "Of course, dearest Harry. That's who we were talking about when this all started. Well, Harry was given to me as a puppy for my 5th birthday. We lived for each other. My mother had that picture painted of us just after I got him. I missed him terribly when he finally died." To the children's surprise, a childlike grin now spread across the old lady's face. "But then you know what, Tom and Stella? It was a few days after I moved back here to the garden, and Harry came back." "Came back!" they exclaimed. "I could barely believe it myself," said Mrs. Moon, chuckling. "You see, I had got up early and had gone for a walk in the garden. I've always woken early since Edward died. And then out of the blue, there they were, the moles again." The old lady frowned and tutted. "They vanished as quickly as they appeared, so naturally I thought I'd imagined it. But then, as I was walking across the lawn, soaking wet, it was Harry, all right. I'd know my Harry anywhere." Confused thoughts flashed through Stella's mind as she tried to take in what she'd heard. "Mrs. Moon, are you telling us that your Harry here is the same Harry you had as a child?" "That's right, dear," said Mrs. Moon, beaming. "And you know, it all makes so much sense." She gazed out toward the garden. "Harry's coming and going didn't bother me at first. I knew he must have found a way to travel between me and my old time. Perhaps the moles divulge themselves to animals more readily. Who knows? He's gone to see the young me." I would chuckle to myself on the days I remembered things clearly. "You see, I believe Harry doesn't want me to grow lonely in my old age. And that's why he keeps coming to see me. It also explains his absences when I was a child." Now the old lady looked down. "But then you know, dears, age has a way of playing tricks on you. I'm over 100 now, and my memory comes and goes from one day to the next. That means I don't always remember about Harry or our adventure." "Wow," said Tom, beaming with admiration. The old lady continued, "You know, I do wonder if the moles have something to do with my long life, and Harry's. He lived until he was 16, you know. That was quite a record back in those days." Stella stared in silent astonishment. Perhaps what Mrs. Moon had told their mother about her age hadn't been so wrong after all. Mrs. Moon paused and then gave the children a strange smile. "You know, Tom and Stella, I feel happy now. I think Harry may have returned to the young Emma for good, to live his life out in peace. That's why I wanted to talk to you before it gets too late." Stella tried to swallow, but a lump had risen in her throat. Was Mrs. Moon telling them she was about to die? The old lady leaned forward and pointed with her frail hands toward a side table. "Look, Stella, in there." Slowly, Stella raised herself from her chair and pulled open a mahogany drawer. Her friendship bracelet, its cotton threads now worn and faded, lay on top of a pile of folded white napkins. She bowed her head, trying to hide her tears as she remembered Hannah's words. "I think you should take it now, dear, said Mrs. Moon with a gentle smile. Tom suddenly jumped up. Mrs. Moon, he blurted out, what's Charlie Green got to do with all this? Has he been down in the time tunnel too? Stella shot him an impatient glance. Mrs. Moon sat back in surprise. Bless me, no, dear, the old lady chuckled. Then she paused and cleared her throat. But oh, I think I do see why you're asking. She studied the carpet for a few moments and then raised her eyes toward Tom. Well, Tom, I have to confess that Charlie does know about the time tunnel and that you went down it. And in fact, he knew about that before you did. Tom and Stella exchanged looks of disbelief. You see, dears, what with Harry coming and going all soaking wet, I felt I really had to explain in case he stopped him going back. Anyway, he was wonderful about it. She shook her head and smiled. You know, I think it was only when you two moved here that he really believed me. He'd always been very protected about the molehills since I told him. And I'm sorry, Tom, if he's been a little sharp about them. But why didn't you tell us you were Emma? Asked Tom. The old lady smiled. How could I, dear? You needed to go and rescue Jack. I didn't dare interfere with that. And then, what with my memory? A grandfather clock chimed in the shadows. Dear me, is it that time? Said Mrs. Moon in a fluster. Nurse Goodson will be here presently. You really must be getting home, dears. They all stood up and slowly she led them out to the kitchen. Well, children, it was wonderful to see you again, and I'm so glad I've been able to share my story with you at last. We'll come and see you tomorrow, said Stella brightly. There's only one more week of the holidays left. Tom nodded in solemn agreement as they stopped out into the cold. Of course, dears. Goodbye, dears. And Mrs. Moon closed the door. We have one chapter left.